Hello there, coming to you from the bunker. This is episode 35 of Watchtower in Focus, the show that zooms in on all things JW, bringing the governing body and its teachings and policies under microscopic scrutiny. Over the last few weeks, the world has been engulfed by the coronavirus pandemic, which has so far claimed more than 100,000 lives and in many lands brought society to a standstill. But how do you respond to a crisis of this kind if you happen to be the leadership of a doomsday cult? Will you resist the temptation to proclaim the end is nigh? And how do you keep control over millions of followers who can no longer physically attend their places of worship? Joining me to examine the way the Jehovah's Witness leadership has responded to COVID-19 are my regular co-hosts, Covert Fade and Mark O'Donnell. Covert and Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
How you doing, Lloyd?
Hey,
I should have renamed myself to COVID Fade for this, really, shouldn't I?
There has been debate on that, whether you should be COVID Fade or Covert-19. So
I like both.
both work.
it's a bit 007-ish.
So it's been a while since we've done an episode, and obviously the world has gone to pot in that time. And I've been debating whether to cover this in a show, but in a way it's just as well we've just waited for things to develop, because it's given us basically a timeline to dissect in terms of how Watchtower has responded initially and how they're now again experiencing, I guess you could say, some kind of hangover on their initial reaction, which was to declare basically, well, this is proof that we're living in the last days of the last days. So it's going to be interesting to watch some clips in order of when the material was either spoken or released, and just track how the organization has responded to the crisis. And I'm fascinated to see what you gentlemen have to say about it.
Yeah, thanks, Lloyd. I think that the Jehovah's Witnesses are in a bit of shock right now because their entire being and mission is based around Matthew 28, 19, and 20, which they interpret as preaching to the ends of the earth, and then the end will come. And now they can't do that except in very small, tiny fragments where they can maybe write letters and make phone calls. But I think, you and Covert could testify to this as former pioneers, auxiliary pioneers, elders, ministerial servants. We were all of those things. And when we went out into the ministry, for most witnesses, the letter writing, the telephone witnessing is just a small kind of an add-on part. And some do it more than others. But when you are confined to doing only that and not being able to preach from door to door, it has put a serious disruption on their whole, being and theology. And I wonder if it will make some of the witnesses give pause and maybe wake up, because I think so many have reached out to us and said to us that it was in their downtime. In fact, yourself, Lloyd, when you found yourself in a foreign country, foreign to your birth country, that you had time to kind of finally process and think, and you weren't, going in the ministry like you used to, and were handling congregation affairs. And it was the same for me. It kind of started when I went into the hospital and was recovering in the hospital and on the couch for a couple of months from collapsed lung and thoracotomy surgery, that, I began to think for myself. And so that's sort of a side question I would pose, to our viewers that will comment later, that maybe that's the way they woke up, and we're hoping that others will wake up that way.
Covert, do you think in many ways this pandemic might serve to kind of hit the reset button for some Jehovah's Witnesses in terms of their whole approach to life and perhaps their faith?
I think it certainly might do. I mean, I think the one of the points that's been made very well is once you start getting out of the kind of the JW social circle, once you're more, you're attending Zoom meetings rather than meeting up frequently with witnesses, it makes it a little easier to sort of wake up because you're not surrounded by that constant social pressure. I think one of the other things that it just struck me, and I've seen a number of people in the XJW community comment on this very shrewdly. What we're actually seeing now in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a global crisis, is actually an outpouring of human generosity and kindness from supposedly worldly people. Just to give one example, I'm in the building where I am. Loads of people have left their phone numbers up on the notice board to say, if you need anyone to go get shopping for you or get prescriptions, call me, I can help. In the UK, the government put out an request for 250,000 people to volunteer to help collect groceries and other essential things for people who couldn't go out. And they were overloaded with volunteers. They ended up with something like 750,000, and they were just looking for 250,000. And although we're seeing a lot of scary and grim news, we're also seeing how in situations like this, people who are supposedly worldly and selfish and non-godly actually rally around each other and show incredible acts of kindness. And one of the things that eventually completely woke me up was my growing cognitive dissonance between told that people in the world were terrible, but then seeing firsthand how sometimes people in the world were far more Christ-like than the Jehovah's Witnesses who surrounded me. And I wonder if that's one aspect of this crisis that might help wake some JWs up.
So that perhaps highlights the fact that this is a pandemic that is going to be impacting people in all sorts of profound ways. And one thing that we're very interested in doing on Watchtower in Focus when the opportunity arises is comparing how these issues might affect other groups. And so for that reason, I'm delighted to introduce an extra panelist on this show, Stephen Hassan, the renowned cult expert, author of Combating Cult Mind Control. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me.
Yes, and I want to point out, Lloyd, you are very generous to let me tell your story in the updated edition of Combating Cult Mind Control.
Indeed. So there is certainly a Jehovah's Witness flavor to that book. But obviously you cover a lot of different groups, and they don't have to be religious, of course. But I'm sure you've been fascinated to see how various different high control groups are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Would it be possible if, along with myself and Mark and Covert, you watch along with us some clips to see how the Jehovah's Witness leadership have been dealing with this pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. But can I just comment briefly, when my book first came out in 1988, I didn't know the Jehovah's Witnesses were a mind control cult. I just had met them while I was a Moonie recruiting, and they tried to recruit me and I tried to recruit them. But it was after that that I started learning about the Watchtower. And a lot of people read the original book that had nothing about the Watchtower in it, which made it okay for people to read. Right. But then when I bought the rights back in 2014 and did an edition in 2015, I faced a dilemma or a choice. Should I talk about the Watchtower, tell the story of ex-members or not? Because I didn't want to alienate people who were still in. But on the other hand, I felt like I had an obligation to tell the general public about the Watchtower and how they really were doing the bite model. So I did decide to put them in, the Mormons in, transcendental meditation in, etc.
Indeed. So. Well, we're grateful that you've turned your attention to this group, and we'll be doing that now. So, Mark, would you be in a position to show us the first clip?
All right. So we're going to do a little screen share here, and let's bring up the first clip here.
So Jehovah is giving us counsel and advice. We want to listen. For example, this virus that is spreading around is giving us an opportunity to see about being obedient. We have many rules or guidelines that are being set for us. We may be quarantined. We may have trips and other things canceled. We may be told to wash our hands, to not shake hands, but elbow bump. Now, of course, we can try hard to be obedient to those rules and guidelines, but we also have an opportunity to not be just obedient to rules and guidelines, but be obedient to the principles behind them. And in this case, often the principle is love of neighbor. We're trying to look out for others with these rules and guidelines when it comes to the virus. And really, when you think about it, any of the opportunities we have now, it's a time to practice being obedient. It really view it as training for us. We have an opportunity to practice being obedient for the future.
So this is a clip that was taken at a morning worship on March 12th, so just over a month ago. And this is the first, you could say, response on video from the Watchtower leadership to COVID-19 chronologically. What do you think we learn from that clip and the way the pandemic is being used by the leaders?
Are you asking me or Mark?
It's open to the panel.
Yeah, I'm gonna do a segue for Steve here, because the operative word I think he used there was the O word, the obedience word, and
Exactly.
I'd love to hear Steve's input on this, because we have a mixture here of sensible things with religious, cult-related things. And some things are good.
I love your cat, by the way.
This is Patches. Yeah. And Patches knows better. She doesn't watch that program, but
She's not
but
very
we have
obedient.
Yeah, so we have this mixture of good things where they're saying obey the superior authorities or the government, but obedience to what we tell you from the branch, from the Moon organization, from the Jehovah's Witness organization, from the Mormon organization, you should listen to that direction. It may mean your life. And as I pointed out in a recent discussion we had online, one congregation actually said if there's no obedience, that Jehovah's Witnesses who don't obey may be guilty of blood guilt. And it was in connection with, obeying, their guidelines on social distancing, but they transferred the government guidelines over to their direction as if it was coming from the Watchtower organization. So I'd love to hear what you have to say, Steve, about the obedience factor.
Right. Pleasure. So, you know my work, Mark, but I don't know about the folks who are, watching this. But for me, this influence continuum is a critical way of thinking about being healthy and having human rights. And on the healthy side of influence, you want to be your own authority. Yes, you can believe in God, but God gave us a conscience and a heart and critical thinking. And there are all these institutions that are claiming to be divine, that they alone know the truth, that are going to control your eternal salvation. And I should say there are political cults and therapy cults and trafficking cults and large group awareness training cults and multi-level marketing, but the patterns are the same. They want obedience. This is the destructive, unethical side of this. This side is using your mind, using your judgment, using your heart, your common sense, versus authoritarian. I'm going to use another little printout from my book and my website. Totalist authoritarian cults want obedience to the leadership. In the case of the Watchtower, it's the governing body. But a lot of other cults that I write about have a leader, a physical person who says, I am an apostle or I am a prophet. I get direct revelations from God. And here's what God wants you to do. Come to church. Don't listen to the government or whatever. But the bottom line is that, in my opinion, is you want to have an internal locus of control as an adult, not an external locus of control. which is authoritarian cults that say, listen to us, don't use your own judgment, your own critical thinking, your own conscience, etc. And you know what really stood out for me too in watching the clip, aside from the obedience thing, was about loving your neighbor, which is for me the essence of good religion or healthy religion on the influence continuum. It's about love, not fear. It's about doing goodness to others, not because they believe what you believe, but because they're nice, they're people, they're human beings, and they deserve to be treated well. And the Watchtower is so horrible with practices like shunning, like the blood transfusion, like the pedophilia predator thing, that they're not applying love your neighbor as you love yourself internally within the authoritarian regime. So if there's anybody kind of on the fence watching this who maybe still is, got a foot in or more in the group, but they're trying to sort out during this very fearful time, should I stay in or should I leave? I think it's absolutely critical to step back and get a bigger perspective about how mind control works with all these other authoritarian cults and how they're all using the fear factor and the instability and the insecurity factor to say, with a powerful voice, trust me, stay in or else, you will lose your salvation or whatever.
Indeed.
So that may be longer than you wanted as a reaction. But
no, it's very helpful. Covert, you like me have family who are still believing Jehovah's Witnesses. Does it concern you that, the first video footage that we have in terms of a reaction to the pandemic is urging the membership to be obedient?
Yeah, it really does, because and it's really following on from obviously that the script, that detailed sort of deep dive Steve gave into why this is so dangerous. This authoritarian mindset, essentially stopping people from trusting their own heart and their own conscience and their own good instincts, and then subsuming that to doing whatever they're told. My family are the kind of Jehovah's Witnesses. They're genuinely very good people. They're very nice people. But the thing that most of us who have JW relatives live in fear of is that they're going to get really stupid directions from the Watchtower organization that makes no sense and then puts their lives directly in danger. But because they've been conditioned this way, they will follow it. And the only reason they will follow this advice is because they've been told, if anyone else had given them this advice, they'd say, you're crazy, we're not going to do it. But because it comes from this this particular organization that they've been conditioned to obey. And as everyone has said, the interesting thing is here, they seem to be treating COVID-19 as a great exercise to train yourself to obey more, rather than just treating it as what it is, which is a crisis which we need to take sensible measures to get through. That's the fear, is that we have no idea what's coming down the line from this organization. And as we've seen before, we've seen the Watchtower give horrifically counterintuitive, stupid advice to Jehovah's Witnesses that gets them killed. And you can never be, like I said, I'm very glad that the Watchtower have taken the step of, yes, obey the government, stay at home, don't congregate. They've allowed the witnesses to meet over Zoom. That's good. It could have easily gone the other way, and they could have said, no, this is a test of your faith. We've all got to congregate together in person to show Jehovah that we love him. And the witnesses would have done that. And so whilst I'm relieved right now that Watchtower are following the government guidelines, they could have easily gone the other way. And I know that my family, which includes people who are in the very vulnerable category, people who, if they get this illness, are extremely likely to die, they would have gone along with it. And so that's why when you see that video, for me, it just makes you very, very worried. So,
yeah, and they could pivot and change 180 degrees at any moment.
Yeah.
That's part of the nature of authoritarian cults. If I can make one more important point, and that is the difference between a legitimate fear and an irrational fear. It's absolutely vital in sorting out, healthy functioning. and part of the paralysis that a lot of people have with what do I trust, what information is truthful and real, and what's conspiracy theory, and etc. And why I'm so happy that the Fauci and Birx is still, involved with the White House, is that they're trying to keep saying we need to look at the data. We can guess a lot of different things, but until we get testing and until we are using the best possible data and the best possible simulations, we can't make judgments that are reasonable. And that's so different than mind control cults that use irrational fears as a mainstay for keeping people dependent and obedient in their group. For example, with the Watchtower, Armageddon is going to happen at any moment, so don't go to college. Don't develop your intelligence and your profession. Don't have children. And Mark did a very important article about the potential plasma therapy that might prove to be efficacious in helping people with this thing.
We are going to mention that because that's an important part of the response, where conceivably, lives could be in the balance, depending on whether this is a viable treatment moving forward. But just to kind of make progress with our timeline.
Yes.
So we've seen the first video, March 12th, which I think was a Thursday. 2 days later, you have the following clip, which is taken from a talk by governing body member Anthony Morris at the Gilead graduation.
As told the brothers in the coordinators committee office, when we're facing these disasters and all these things, and I've been telling them for some time now, cheer up, it's going to get worse. And so we keep a sense of humor with it, but that's a fact. What we're experiencing right now in this global pandemic, I was telling the branch class yesterday, it doesn't bother me. We've been waiting for this. We knew things like this were going to happen. Christ Jesus has prepared us. Where's the shock? Now you got to think, and Jehovah directs us with how to deal with these things, but we endure.
So it doesn't bother me.
Jesus made it clear.
We've been waiting for this, was the reaction there by governing body member Anthony Morris, starting to see more of a doomsday narrative being supplanted on the coronavirus pandemic. I'm interested to hear the thoughts of the panel.
Tony Morris. What can you say about Tony Morris? I think if ever there was a loose cannon among the Jehovah's Witness leadership, it would be Tony Morris. And, I thought about this. Jehovah's Witnesses have about 8 or 8.5 million followers in their religion. And these are spread worldwide. But overall, they are inclined to tell you that they are the size of a small nation. In fact, many of the brothers I used to work with in what we called RBC or LDC and Building Kingdom Hall, they said, well, brother, we can reach out to anyone in the nation and supply, a need, a computer programmer or a concrete, pouring expert or any of these things. We have a nation. And so here's Tony Morris saying, he's giving direction to his nation of followers that they believe are the only ones who will survive this Armageddon. And, he's saying to them, doesn't bother me. Bible predicted it. So get on board. Better learn to live with it. I think that's cold and callous. And he said that before we started hearing lots and lots of cases of even Jehovah's Witnesses contracting. I know many in Italy, of course, you would expect in Italy especially, that everyone across the board is affected. Then we started having cases popping up here in the United States, and things are obviously getting pretty bad, especially in New York. I think we passed the 10,000 death mark.
Well, if a single Jehovah's Witness, if anyone dies, quite frankly, of this pandemic, it's wrong to say it doesn't bother me, but especially if you're the leader of an organization that claims to care for your flock, to say it doesn't bother me when you will have followers who have lost people, lost loved ones due to this pandemic. But I think it was a display of bravado, wasn't it? He was trying to impress people that he had basically foreseen this. It was it was an attempt at impressing people, was it
and
not?
very callous. I think it was very callous. And we look back over the 1918 pandemic. This is what I grew up with as a Jehovah's Witness, who said that, of course, they use the term pestilence in the scripture, and that would mark the sign of the last days, and that pestilence would be one of the signs that we're at the last end of the last days. But 1918 is something that I grew up with as the Spanish flu happened in 1918, and look at how many it killed, more than were killed in World War I, and this was a sign. And now here, 102 years later, we've got this, equivalent or worse of the Spanish flu. But I never remember hearing Judge Rutherford back in 1918 saying, "Doesn't bother me." And he gave all sorts of speeches and wrote books and booklets and everything. But I feel like we're in this new era, and I don't know what Steve thinks, but I don't know how much, Steve, you've heard Tony Morris speak, because you cover many different religious groups. Yeah, this is a guy that's one of the eight governing body members. The first man you heard was a helper to the governing body. This man is what they consider, he's the Pope of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so I mean the playbook of cult leaders is whatever's happening that you can use to promote your power and authority over everybody else, you do that. So if, and some groups will even say they created the tsunami wave or they in order to get people to pay attention. In this case, it's more like, of course this is going to happen. It's been predicted. We've been waiting for this. So no big deal. I would love to talk with this guy, actually. I would love to have a conversation.
It really depends what time of day you're talking as to how coherent he's
going to invite him on, Lloyd, and I can chat with him? Or
I would pay a substantial amount of money to see that. I really would. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, he's not going to be coming on the channel.
But it would be interesting if anyone's in the group to bring up me and the fact that I was in the Moonies and I've studied Chinese communist brainwashing, and what is his take on combating cult mind.
He ran running in the streets from journalist Trey Bundy, and I don't think he'll talk to any one of us.
Yeah, anyway. No, I think, honestly, you guys should be doing more strategic messaging towards the governing body and specific questions that they may not be willing to answer publicly, but at least would engender questions in all the followers.
Interesting strategy. But I think this clip, would it be fair to say, covert, it does trespass into this area of doomsday fearmongering, because it's attaching a doomsday spin to the pandemic.
And to follow with what Steve was saying, I mean, Watchtower has a real track record of this. If you look at their publications, they have basically latched onto every major, especially the Watchtower articles. If you go back the last 80 years, if something major happens, like the 9/11 attacks or the tsunami or anything like that, there will be Watchtower articles trying to harness this. Sometimes they manage to do it less ghoulishly than others. Sometimes it's really ghoulish and very obviously kind of like jumping on it as an opportunity. The thing that I think is fascinating now, and again, I think probably for people who study cults in depth, like yourself, Lloyd, and like Steve, I think you're both going to be. The thing in the past is cult leaders would make these propositions, but would make these proclamants. That's not a real word. Proclamations, but not necessarily on video. So there are so many of them now saying this stuff on video. Like when 9/11 happened, you wouldn't really get any governing body members captured saying stuff about it on video. But now you do. And this is the fascinating thing, is we're going to see on video how actual leaders in the Watchtower are responding to it. So, Stephen and Lloyd can literally make notes and refer to it. And now we've got even more documentary evidence on how Tony Morris, for example, is very dismissive about it. And, we foretold this and I'm not really bothered, and, who cares, just get on board because we're all, we knew this was coming prophetically. And it's interesting to lock in that Tony, and I don't know if Stephen's heard this, Tony's been, Tony is one of the people who believes he will be magically taken to heaven to participate in the Battle of Armageddon.
Oh, he's in the 144.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, and Watchtower they've got a lot more up front recently about saying how that means that members of the Anointed will participate in slaughtering God's enemies, and Tony really likes talking about this. So when you know that background and then you hear him speak like that about a pandemic, it makes a lot of sense as to what goes on in his brain.
Yeah, he's relishing the prospects of riding to judgment at Armageddon and slaughtering everyone like us who doesn't follow him. So that's the sort of man we're dealing with.
Get in line for all the cults that want to slaughter me.
But Covert, you raise an interesting point, which is that it's one thing to kind of write embarrassing things in publications that can very easily be buried in the sands of time. But now we're in the JW broadcasting era where the governing body need to be very careful about what they say on camera in HD, and they're not being careful. And the best example of that is the next clip that Mark's going to play for us, which is Stephen Lett speaking in the coronavirus report, which was released on March 18th, so 4 days after Tony Morris's Gilead comments.
Jesus made it clear at Luke 21:11 that pestilence would be part of the sign of the last days. And in Revelation chapter 6, the ride of the fourth horseman includes mention of deadly plague. So the events unfolding around us are making clearer than ever that we're living in the final part of the last days, undoubtedly the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
So in our timeline, this is where we reach the pinnacle of Jehovah's Witness leaders attaching a doomsday spin to the pandemic. They're going to start backpedaling in the next clip. But what do we make of this? Again, this leaping on a catastrophe as evidence that we are in the final part of the final part of the last days of the last days.
Yeah, I saw this particular video, and I was a combination of laughing and crying. And I love the arm pump, But he's also very asymmetrical. If you look at his face, it's like what he's privately thinking and what he's publicly saying is.
I try not to look at his face too much. It's too scary.
Very incongruent. Yeah. He has a very radio voice that's very confident. But all I can say is there are thousands of cults that are saying exactly the same thing to their followers, only people have to be in their group to be saved. And that's why when you pull back to look at the phenomenon worldwide, it's pathetic. It's so stereotypical, it's pathetic.
Indeed. Do you think this is going to age well, Mark?
No, I don't think it's going to age well. So, for those that may be watching for the first time, learning about Jehovah's Witnesses, they believe that 1914 is the date that the so-called Gentile times ended, and that God's kingdom began reigning invisibly from that date forward. Although they believe that Satan was also cast down to the vicinity of the earth, and that Satan is causing all of these things since 1914. And so they cited World War I and the Spanish influenza, and they quote mine for all of these things, such as earthquakes in one place after another. They say since 1914, we've had more earthquakes than any other time period in history combined. And of course, that's not true. But what they do is they've got witnesses believing that, because people want to believe. They want to look at the scripture and believe that they are living in the only time period that's important, because it's relative to them. It's we only see what we can see. So you've got the pestilences, the food shortages, which certainly is a problem, the earthquakes, which certainly are a problem, all of these things, the pestilences. So they are saying, and Stephen Lett is saying, that not only did this start in 1914, but we are in the last part of the last days. So they don't make predictions exactly like they used to. It's more passive aggressive now. The last big prediction was 1975, got the organization into a lot of trouble when Armageddon didn't happen in 1975. But now it's sort of left up to the individual witness to interpret what he means by the last part of the last days. And
Yeah.
how else can you interpret that?
Well, so many of these things are, you could say, to some degree open to interpretation. Covert, I mean, trying to kind of look at things from their perspective. Again, I don't think this is going to age well, but I'm trying to imagine how they're going to try and defend this in the future. And his actual wording was, so many of the things that we see around us are making it clearer than ever that we are living in the final part of the final blah, blah, blah. So do you think the wording was sufficiently vague for this to not be embarrassing, or do you think that that's just a cop-out?
I think it's actually a little bit of both. I think what Watchtower seems to be doing now, and I think Mark picked on this, is that this is very kind of words that if you just don't look into them, sounds like, oh, Armageddon is imminent, it's the last of the last of the last days. But if you take the words he said, you could drop them into things that Watchtower have been saying more or less at any part of their history, because they never specify how long a day is. So, you could quite see that in 50 years' time, Stephen Lett would be going, we are now in the last of the last of the last of the last of the last days. And then in 10 years' time, they add another last to that. And it's wording that, because you're not putting any definitive timescales on anything. I mean, if this is prophecy, because I could make a prophecy right now that at some point something bad is going to happen, and that will prove that I'm right. Well, that's not a prophecy. A prophecy is on July 26th of 2029. The following volcano will erupt at 6:34 a.m. And the following people, that's a prophecy. If you can do that, then it's like, wow, there's something's going on here. But so much of what Watchtower does is essentially at some point something bad will happen. And if lots of bad things are happening, it proves that we're right about everything else. And it's so generic, anyone can make that prophecy.
Right, exactly. Mark was talking about confirmation bias, and if you have a belief, you're looking for anything that will reinforce and confirm your belief. The other thing I wanted to say is just, the meaning of the communication is the response it elicits. And if you're trying to make people afraid and they better, get back into the group, get into the ark because the torrential rain is going to fall and you're going to be drowned. His messaging was effective in terms of the last moment of the last days. But again, what Covert was saying is that in real time, it's meaningless, because the witnesses, I mean, Christians have been believing Jesus is coming back for 2,000 years. And that's historical fact. This is not something that started with the Watchtower. This has been going on forever, and there have been earthquakes forever, and volcanoes and tidal waves, etc. But I have a fear now in this nuclear age where people are thinking apocalyptically, like the Om Shinrikyo sarin gas cult in Japan, where the guru, who claimed to be Jesus, by the way, and Buddha, Shoko Asahara, wanted to stimulate Armageddon. So he had people manufacturing this Nazi nerve gas and putting it in Tokyo subways as a way to prove his prophecy that the end times were coming. He's dead. They hung him in Japan for his crimes.
But do you fear sometimes, Stephen, about self-fulfilling prophecy?
That's what I'm saying. I'm worried that there are all of these ideologically totalitarian people The dictator of North Korea comes to mind, for example, where he would think nothing of sending nuclear bombs everywhere if somebody attacked him. Like Jim Jones, oh, my people are leaving with him. They're going to come back after me. Let's kill everybody.
Indeed.
That kind of mentality is very frightening to me.
It's very interesting that you mentioned Aum Shinrikyo, and we don't really have time to go into this now, but we've talked about the people who defended the cult of Aum Shinrikyo, and we recently discovered that the three so-called researchers, some of them have credentials, actually are the ones who defended the Jehovah's Witnesses in the Netherlands when they went up against the government. They filed an appeal over the government's
yeah, I've done a few blogs on this about cult apologists who are sociologists of religion, and they get paychecks to go say, oh, this isn't a cult, it's not brainwashing, but they have no credentials in terms of understanding social psychology or hypnosis or cults.
Yeah, I think it would be revealing if witnesses knew what was going on behind the scenes, but most don't.
So we've seen the pinnacle, if you like, of Jehovah's Witnesses attaching a doomsday spin to COVID-19. In the next clip, they are going to start backpedaling quite dramatically or noticeably. So, Mark, could you show us that?
What's the lesson? Well, the lesson is that as pressures mount, we need to continue to make sure that we are thinking God's thoughts. We need to continue to trust the channel that Jehovah is using. Now, these events over the past few months have reminded us or shown us, demonstrated how quickly the world can change. For 1 minute, it's riding high. The next minute, it's in panic. It's in turmoil. We've also seen how quickly our lives can change. From 1 minute, we're with our congregations, we're serving Jehovah, we're working, going on vacations, traveling to assignments, and suddenly, everything is stopped. Well, we do not know where these events, current events, are heading. This may just be another marker in time and an event in history or not. But what we do know is that these events illustrate how quickly the world can become unglued and become completely faint out of fear. And we also know that just as Jesus needed the full support of his apostles as it got closer to the end of his life, the same is needed today as we get closer to the end. The governing body, our branch committees, the brothers who are taking the lead, they need our support. They need us, not as a stumbling block, not as distractors, but fully behind them.
So we've gone from, quite aside from the kind of manipulative rhetoric in Robert Lucioni's talk there about following the channel, we've gone from Stephen Lett declaring COVID-19 to be evidence that we're in the final part of the last days of the last days, to Robert Lucioni, who is a governing body helper, in a morning worship talk saying, well, this could be just another marker in time or just another event in history. We don't know yet. So it's, to me at least, it seems like the coronavirus hangover is kicking in, and they're like, maybe Stephen Lett's comments will prove to be embarrassing, and maybe we need to start putting out a bit of a counter narrative that maybe this isn't proof that Armageddon is literally about to happen.
Yeah, I'd say that's a good analysis, Lloyd. I think that's exactly what it is, hedging bets, and let's not have anything. And Covert was talking about it. If there's a prophecy of a particular day and time and a particular place, it either comes true or it doesn't. The Bible says if it doesn't come true, kill the person who said it, like stone and false prophet. Not that anyone we know has been stoned to death in reality, but I just think, for most of my career, the Watchtower has not been online. And I think them moving online, and now with the COVID thing where everybody is at home online and getting indoctrinated online, but people have more access to the internet. I think it's going to be a continued profound shift, and I do predict younger people are going to be leaving more quickly than the older parents, would be my sense.
To your counterpoint regarding, these comments from two different groups, you have one group of men that are governing body members. They are considered the anointed representatives, part of the 144,000 going to heaven. And then you have the governing body helpers who may or may not become governing body members at some point. I think that part of what we're seeing is a chain of command issue here. I think we're seeing the very top where Tony Morris and Stephen Lett of the governing body are really given a pass because they are the governing body. They are God's immediate channel of communication. And for those that may not know this, a few years back, the Watchtower organization, or the governing body, announced that only they are the faithful and discreet slave mentioned in the gospel accounts. So that means just the 8 men are the channel of communication by which Jehovah, or God, communicates with his followers here on earth. So then when you have Robert Lucioni and the other helpers giving comments, I think that they are necessarily somewhat reserved. And, I can't get into their heads, but being in the organization as long as I was, I think that they are somewhat hesitant to step on the toes of Lett and Morris and go out on a limb, whereas Lett and Morris can kind of get away with it, whether it offends witnesses or not. Like with Morris's comments, kind of, that remains to be seen. But I think it is a chain of command.
I would just be fascinated to be a fly on the wall at some of the meetings that have been going on regarding what spin do we put on this, what do we tell the brothers, how do we pitch this. And it seems to me fairly obvious that at some point there's been a bit of a pushback to the narrative of older heads like Tony Morris and Stephen Lett, where perhaps governing body helpers or younger governing body members have said, whoa, hold on a minute. We can imagine this being the build-up to Armageddon, but we can also imagine things going right back to normal, and then we'll be left with this embarrassing footage. So quick, let's start throwing cold water on this. Covert, do you sense that there has been this kind of hangover moment where they've decided to change course a little bit?
And I think this links to something that happened in Watchtower's past, that we actually saw them try and whitewash recently. So in 1975, there was a fairly infamous incident where Watchtower basically said, 1975 is going to bring about the Battle of Armageddon. And this has haunted them ever since. And what we actually saw recently was a video that came out from Watchtower that essentially tried to whitewash what happened and say, it was just a few Jehovah's Witnesses who got it into their heads. We never said that. And I think there's there's like an institutional memory in Watchtower of what happened there. And I think that what happened is the governing body got all excited and happy about what was happening. And just because they're not used to having to watch what they say, because no one really challenges the governing body, they splurted out with all this before, like, as you said, like the kind of the management layer that actually works underneath. Which, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the governing body helpers who actually are way more kind of mentally switched on than the governing body when you see the way the governing body act. And that might just be a question of age and stuff. Said, whoa, we remember what happened in 1975. We don't want this coming back to haunt us. So we better stick some major small print into this, what we're saying right now, and some major caveats, so that if in 10 years time, as we're all hoping that this goes, this is remembered as a strange period of human history, and then things went back to normal and they rebuilt and everything else, that we don't look too dumb. We need some caveats in here. So I suspect that's probably true.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Covert.
No, I was basically done.
I was just gonna, something occurred to me and Mark's comments about the Melton and others who were cult apologists who were speaking for Shinrikyo, that I would guess that the leadership, somebody in the Watchtower, is talking to cult leaders in Scientology and the Moonies and other cults, and sharing lawyers, sharing cult apologists, sharing resources. And the other thing is that cults like Scientology and the Moonies would hire outside PR firms of non-believers to get, like, how do we message this? Or how do we handle the fact that Moon was convicted and sent to jail as a felon? Let's spin it that he's being persecuted because he's Korean, and let's spend $30 million on a campaign. I have to imagine that in this time period, it isn't just insular where the people are sitting in one room in the governing body talking strategy, but I would guess that they would be starting to talk to outsiders about what to do. And
they are in terms of specific things, Steve. In fact, I haven't written on survey about this, but in the child abuse cases, Watchtower has been commiserating, I don't know a better word, with attorney Robert Crockett, who represents the Mormon Church in a number of cases. And we have all of this in writing. I just haven't published an article about it yet, but their attorneys have been working together with Watchtower attorneys in order to help escape some of the decisions that have come against both churches in relation to their child abuse cover-ups, because they both have the same problem. They've got child abuse cases. They have their own internal network where only their bishops or elders report and calls are made to one phone, either the Watchtower legal department or Mormon's legal department. And this is a problem because both churches have a secret database of child abuse. And yes, they are.
Yeah, and it's a lot about money because they're going to have to pay large judgments to all the victims of both groups. And it serves their purposes to try to not have precedent-setting cases. So I would have no doubt that other cults would send their attorneys to Montana or whatever to, like, how are we going to do this? I guess the whole idea of brainwashing and mind control and cults, confusing to everybody.
I guess I'd find it hard to believe personally that they're collaborating when it comes to theology and when it comes to their kind of doomsday spin on things like the coronavirus pandemic. But yes, they are certainly collaborating. We have evidence, JW survey, and Mark has evidence of lawyers collaborating, and also with the child abuse experts. They've had expert opinions published by experts who just so happen to have also written very favorable things for the Moonies and Scientology. So there's definitely that element of things happening.
And I have to believe that the Watchtower has a department. Maybe it's only 2 or 3 people, but trustworthy people, quote unquote, who are monitoring you guys and like what are they saying and how do we counter it. And it's those people who actually have a very high washout rate of people who exit cults because they are listening to critics and former members and such.
That we've done episodes on subpoena warfare and how Watchtower is taking more of an interest.
I do love the idea of them being like someone being taken into a department. It's like, right, you're replacing Bob. What happened to Bob? Oh, he left the faith. He was replacing Bill. What happened to Bill? He left the faith too. But don't worry, you'll be fine.
No, what they said in the Moonies was I was away on a secret mission, like for months.
How's the mission going, Stephen? It's been very convincing.
And then I was brainwashed by the deprogrammers and Satan when I went on national television. But they will typically never say so-and-so left the group. They'll just like divert attention.
They'll have a narrative to explain why that
But
person's
remember
not there.
George Orwell's 1984 and Winston's job was going through all the records and getting rid of names of loyal people because they defected.
Indeed. So we have one more clip in our timeline to look at, and this is less to do with, you could say, the hangover element, and more to do with the question of if you are a high control group and you're in a situation where your followers are socially isolating and not able to receive the love bombing and the social kind of effect of attending their places of worship, how do you maintain control? So this is the most recent coronavirus report that was posted on jw.org. It doesn't mention anything about the doomsday aspect, but it does very much prepare Jehovah's Witnesses for how the organization is responding.
We know that more and more of you are being affected by the coronavirus pandemic. You can't go to work. You can't go to school. You can't go to the Kingdom Hall or preach from house to house. Some of you have lost your jobs, and you have no idea how you're going to be able to feed your family. Others have family members who live far away. There's no one else in the house. They're worried about them. And sadly, some are mourning the loss of loved ones who have been victims of the disease. We want you to know that our heart aches for you. We're so sorry for your loss. Now, these are very stressful times, but it's important to remember one thing. No friend of Jehovah is ever truly alone. Here's the promise Jehovah made, that he was going to raise up shepherds who will really shepherd them. And then at the end it says, none of them will be missing. Of course, these shepherds are also concerned about your physical well-being. So from time to time, they may also check in on us to make sure that we have basic food items, medications, and other necessary things. Now, if they do that, don't be shy. Let the elders know your needs. They may also provide practical suggestions on how you can protect your health. Now, what season are we in? Memorial season. So what should be the real focus of our thoughts at this time? The incredible gift of the ransom, the love of Jehovah God, the love of Christ Jesus. Those things should be the object of our thoughts. And when you feel alone or stressed out, repeat to yourself the heart-cheering words that we find at Hebrews 13:5. I will never leave you, and I will never abandon you. I will never leave you, and I will never abandon you.
So you have this situation where 8.5 million Jehovah's Witnesses, or most of 8.5 million Jehovah's Witnesses, can no longer go to their kingdom halls, are isolated, are in a position where they can perhaps meditate a little bit and take a step back and try to figure out whether their beliefs are really true or not. And the organization is responding by preparing them for shepherding visits over the telephone or over Skype or Zoom, where elders will be essentially reminding them of what their beliefs are. And you even have a governing body member, David Splain, more or less telling them to recite a mantra. Is any of this surprising for you, Stephen?
Not at all. I mean, it's just so stereotypical from the cult leader's playbook on how to try to maintain control and make it seem like you stay in the group and you live, and if you exit, then you're toast. And that's what Robert Lifton wrote in 1961 when he was analyzing Chinese communist brainwashing. Number 8 of his criteria is dispensing of existence, where if you remain true to the party, then you have a right to exist. And if you exit, you're toast. You're no longer, genuine, you have no hope, etc. And I just hope that all of the people in the cult who are online are exposed to, like Pastor Tony Spell. I just did a video where he was saying, so what if people die? They'll be, saved by Jesus. I'm giving out blue anointed handkerchiefs that will, help keep them safe. And I hope they watch things like that and then start going, but they think they're going to be saved by following this guy. Like, what's so different about what the Watchtower is, other than I've been spending all these years in the group.
It is certainly an excellent opportunity, this pandemic, if you want to call it that, for people to just take a step back and take stock and think, do my beliefs really make sense? Are you surprised, Covert, by the way the governing body is responding?
Not really, because as we said, one of the recurring themes of almost everything Watchtower does is how do we make sure everyone's controllable? And as has been pointed out, when you're at home just getting stuff over Zoom, you're spending a lot more time on the internet. As Stephen has said, there's not just Jehovah's Witness stuff on the internet. There's lots of stuff pointing out why Jehovah's Witness theology might be wrong, and there's lots of other stuff as well. So Watchtower has obviously said, this could be a problem, and we need to reach out, get the elders in there to make sure that whatever methods of control we have established are locking in. And the other thing I think is worth pointing out, one of the things that helped to wake me up was realizing that Jehovah's Witnesses weren't special in the way that they did things. And I think that's one of the things that's great about reading Stephen's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, is to realize, Jehovah's Witnesses are just the same as all these other cults in what they do. And once you realize that the Jehovah's Witness playbook for controlling people is so similar to the playbook of so many other high control groups and cults and organizations, it does a lot to kind of break you out of the feeling that this organization is special and unique and couldn't be replicated by anyone else. You start to realize actually in some ways it's very, very common. And seeing what they're doing now to try and, keep everyone in control, and you'll see all the other cults doing this, all the other this being replicated across the world. I think it's, if you're on the way out as a Jehovah's Witness or a doubting Jehovah's Witness, or you're a Jehovah's Witness, an ex-Jehovah's Witness who sometimes gets a fear about, okay, what if they are right after all? Looking at this stuff through an analytical lens helps you reestablish the truth that no, they're not. They're just a cult, and it's okay to step away.
Yeah, and they're liars.
Yeah.
They're not trustworthy, and they're not biblical. And there's so many things to analyze that. It's absolutely critical. And, I know that there's a lot of folks who are atheists and agnostics. I don't want to turn anyone off. I've been through everything in my 44-year journey after the Moonies. But when I was in the Moonies, Armageddon was 1977, guys, by the way. but to really
we were 2 years out.
This is a mind control technique to take advantage of people's irrational fears or rational fears, because there really is danger, to manipulate people to say, trust me, I can save you, there is hope. But in fact, it's a mirage. It's not real. And that real religion is based on truth and love and compassion and charity. And a group that tells you don't talk to your brother, your sister, your mother, or father, because we say that you can't. This is automatic exit, danger, danger. This is not what spiritual and loving religious teaching is supposed to be about. Or it's horrendous for Jews. Jews believe in life, and to have scriptures used from the Torah to say, no, you can't have a blood transfusion, you should die from blood loss, or you can't get a plasma transfusion, that's heresy to Jewish people. It's like God wants us to live, people.
So, Steve, let me ask you something just quickly. There's a movement right now, not a movement, but there's a heightened interest in the media over the Orthodox Jewish communities. And I know that it's fair to say that you belong to a Jewish community, right? Not
the controversy is what's called the ultra-Orthodox, which I call cults.
Or the Hasidim or Hasidic. And there's some great programs. I'm trying to think of the name of a new one.
There's one called Unorthodox about the Satmar sect, which was basically people who fled because of Hitler. And
that's the one I just watched. Yes, they made the point.
And they wear these huge hats like they did in the 1800s, and they only speak Yiddish.
Made of mink.
They don't educate their kids, and it's
right.
It's a mind control cult.
Yeah, it's on Netflix. It's called Unorthodox, and there were some terrific parallels in that. I think it's maybe a 6-episode series. It's well worth watching, but there's some terrific JW parallels in that because of the level of control. It was based around a young woman who was raised in this Hasidic community, and she was basically just expected to she couldn't publicly sing or do anything. She had to bear children for her husband, and it was like, I don't want to go into all the details. It's
there's a lot of parallelisms,
but you could watch her journey out of that, and how it tore her husband up, who also had some doubts, but he wanted to bring her back. She ended up, the story begins where she flees to Germany, but as you pointed out, the whole purpose of this particular Hasidic group was to repopulate following the Holocaust, because they lost 6 million, and they want to, and
no, exactly.
York.
It's exactly, your point is so important, because when you're in a mind control cult, you're so indoctrinated to not have negative thoughts or negative feelings at all, and with phobias, the whole dissociative identity. But even their authentic selves know that there's something really wrong with it. But exposure to another cult, learning about a different cult, opens your eyes. That's really obvious that that's bogus. That's really obvious.
I think
controlling people.
The takeaway that I have from that is that, you have healthy Christian beliefs, and you have very unhealthy Christian beliefs or cults, and then you have healthy Jewish beliefs and very, very unhealthy Jewish beliefs and patterns. And I see the two of those running side by side, especially with Jehovah's Witnesses, where you have people that are persons of faith, but then you have the ultra Orthodox controlling. There you go on your chart. You have the ultra Orthodox control.
It is a continuum, Mark. It is, there are different aspects, and then people can be, core members and have a lot of control. Like if they're at Bethel, or if they're on a mission for the Mormons or something, they can be here. But most members are out here, just giving money and going to do their whatever the group demands them to do out here. But it looks different depending on if you're here or here or here or here or here. And that's why I want people to step back. Remember, the solution to blind faith is perspective.
Arguably, you get more perspective when you're in a lockdown situation. You have lots of time on your hands to watch Netflix and Tiger King and see very, very vivid representations of cult control in various manifestations, and start asking those questions of yourself. But you have in the Coronavirus Report 2 by David Splain, essentially witnesses being told, well, before you have too much time to connect the dots and do this thinking, expect a phone call. And incidentally, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that they rebranded these Coronavirus Report videos. Originally, if you went on jw.org, they were titled Coronavirus Report 1 and Coronavirus Report 2. They've rebranded them 2020 Governing Body Report 1 and 2020 Governing Body Report 2. Again, maybe it's just me being cynical, but I sense that they're trying to distance themselves entirely from the word coronavirus, just in case,
Google searches.
Well, I think that Stephen Lett's video message is going to come back to haunt them repeatedly, quite frankly. And I think that they're already taking steps to distance themselves from it.
It's going to be like they don't want it to be a short term, like not a short term. Like people just say 1975 and everyone knows the scandal. You say Royal Commission, everyone knows the scandal. If they don't play this well, everyone's going to be able to, the apostate community will be able to say coronavirus, and everyone will know the scandal of Watchtower getting all excited about this and then having to backtrack. And so, that could well be a reason why they're like, look, just get that. Let's disassociate that word from what we're doing. Let's pull back from the brink.
So what we'll do now, if it's okay, is we'll take a moment for Covert to take us through some news stories in his wonderful style of presenting the news. And then what we typically do is go to the panel for concluding
I'm
comments.
going to need to go, guys.
Okay.
I apologize.
We'll bid goodbye to Stephen. Thank you so much for your
Thanks.
insights, Stephen.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Covert.
It's been lovely to have you.
Always a pleasure, Steve.
Thanks,
And
Steve.
I invite people to check out freedomofmind.com and my blogs about all these other cults. And I've had Mark on a few times. And Lloyd, we should do one with you.
That'd be lovely.
Future as well. Thanks so much,
Thanks
guys.
so much,
Steve.
Stephen.
Cheers, Stephen.
Bye.
Wonderful. And then there were three.
Hey.
So I'm sure that at this point in the show, I speak for thousands of viewers in saying that what they really need is for Covert Fade to introduce the news.
And cue the music. So I have one piece of news to read today, but I was quite surprised when I read through this, because part of this story is going to be sadly very familiar, but part of this is very new, and I'm very curious to see what you guys think. So this is a story that comes from city of Birmingham in the UK, and it refers to a man named Clifford Whiteley, who's a Jehovah's Witness, age 73, who's just been jailed for sex abuse, child sex abuse. And the trial took place, he's been convicted, but one of the things that came out of the trial was that the congregation refused to help the police because Clifford Whiteley had confessed his abuse to the elders, but the elders then refused to pass those details of the confession on to the police. Now, the reason they cited was not what we usually hear in this case is they say, well, it's clergy privilege, or we have religious reasons for not passing it on. What they cited in this case was GDPR. Their position was that GDPR prevented them from passing details of a serious sexual offence onto law enforcement. So this story was in the Birmingham Mail.co.uk on Birmingham Live. It's Googleable. I'm sure there'll be show notes, and you can find it on Lloyd's Twitter feed and my Twitter feed. But yeah, guys, what do you think of that? GDPR stops you reporting crime.
It's absolutely disgusting, isn't it? And I think, look, Sarah Davies has been tweeting about it as well, because she is something of an expert on GDPR as well as being involved in ICSA. And she made the point that GDPR regulations in no way prevent the reporting of crime, and organizations cooperating with police investigations. Look, this is, well, it's disgusting for an organization that routinely flouts GDPR regulations by harvesting data willy-nilly without asking for consent in most cases, to then turn around and say, oh, sorry, we can't allow justice to proceed because of GDPR. That's just not how GDPR works. So for them to use that in particular as an excuse it's evil.
And I wonder, Lloyd, in Covert, if this is somehow a miscommunication or mistranslation between when the journalist wrote the story. And look, I don't know who originally said that it was because of GDPR. I don't know if it's maybe you can...
It would have been nice for more information and more background. But having said that, I guess we have to take a newspaper report on this at face value. If they're saying they gave this as a reason, until documented evidence comes to the contrary.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to believe, my personal theory without having seen this case is that they might really be referring to clergy penitent privilege as the reason why they wouldn't cooperate with the police. Because this is the case with almost all child sexual abuse cases, is that the elders fail to hand over documentation on the basis of their clergy penitent privilege in whatever country they
But you
live
could
in.
argue that that's a very different. Clergy penitent privilege is not the same as data protection laws.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I mean, maybe there's more to this, but it seems to be
Yeah.
fairly definitive reading the story that GDPR does seem to be. And the theory I have, I mean, there's no way that the branch weren't involved in this, because we know that the branch get involved anytime the bodies of elders are contacted by police about child sex abuse. There's no way the branch wouldn't have been involved. And so I wonder if maybe they're trying a new strategy. If maybe they're like, well, we know we're trying out the clergy penitent privilege thing in various places. Let's see what happens if we drop GDPR as a reason. I mean, this is all. I mean, I'm going to
Like
say
an
right now.
experimental argument. Yeah,
Exactly. I mean, I'm going to say, I'm sure this is all speculation. I am simply theorizing, but it just seems so bizarre. But like I said, we know that the branch will always get involved if there's a body of elders that's being dragged to court because of, even if they're just silently advising that congregation without ever officially getting involved. We know the way Watchtower works. So if it was genuinely the case that it's GDPR they've cited, I can't see how that's not a deliberate choice from the branch.
Well, let me ask you this speculation question while we're speculating. So I think one of the recent articles on the JW.org website talks about, it shows an elderly woman and how she's getting on with her preaching activity despite being confined to her home. And you can see the woman is at a table, and she's got a pretty long, what appears to be a spreadsheet of names and phone numbers in front of her. And what I caught on that was that she's doing this letter writing to people, which is something that witnesses fairly commonly do. They get long lists of addresses, but they made a specific point of pointing out that she's located in the United States. Because somehow, and maybe you guys can correct me on this, but I don't think that would play out very well if they showed a person from the UK with a spreadsheet of names doing letter writing. Am I correct in that?
That would play very badly in the UK. Yeah.
So we have this differential between what United States witnesses can do. I
clearly remember as an elder that being an issue, because it would come up every now and then. Obviously, we'd be using many of the same materials as you guys had in America, and every now and then there'd be some mention of letter writing, and people would say, "Oh, can we do letter writing?" And it was basically my job as an elder at one point to say, "No, we can't. You know, that doesn't apply to us." Or I may have been asking as a pioneer or servant, and that was the answer I was given, and then I started giving that answer to other people. So the data protection laws would prohibit that. Yeah.
You guys weren't in the practice of using reverse telephone directories at all? That was extremely common. It's
not inconceivable that some did it, but it's very, very shady grounds, even before GDPR came in, when it was
the
Data Protection Act. So, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that they've specifically mentioned United States, if that's what you're saying.
So what I'm saying is, by extension of that, any of the countries that are located in the EU under the GDPR regulations would have an exceptionally difficult time doing telephone witnessing and letter writing to people that they don't know their name, they can't get their names. You know, you're not allowed to have these lists of data of people in the United Kingdom, and rightly so under GDPR law.
I don't know how they'll do it in Europe. I mean, if anyone
that's
can
the point.
Know in the comments how on earth people are doing preaching under lockdown in Europe, I'd love to hear. I can only imagine that it's a situation where anyone in your phone book, literally in your phone book, who happens to not be a witness, is going to get inundated with text messages saying, "Can I share a positive thought with you?" or blah blah blah. I can only imagine that's happening, to be honest.
Yeah, and they're also getting very creative. I monitor the social media accounts of many witnesses on Instagram and other places, and I mean, you know, they're kind of going crazy with it. I've seen in Italy where they're, you know, lowering, where they have a witness up on the second floor, and then down below she's got a whole cart full of pamphlets, and she's watching people go by taking the pamphlets. But I think the best one I saw yesterday was in New Zealand, where a witness said, "Well, we can't go preaching anymore, so I've tied a QR code, a large QR code, says nothing else, just a giant QR code, to a tree, and in hopes that people passing by the tree will hold their phone up and scan the QR code, which takes them right to jw.org.
Oh dear. Yeah. Okay,
I mean,
yeah. Let us know, viewers, in the comments what imaginative ways Jehovah's Witnesses are coming up with to continue preaching under lockdown.
That's the sign of Pandora's box opening, that is.
So, are there any other news stories, Covert?
That's the only one I have. It's been
one.
a relatively quiet lockdown so far, but you know, who knows what will happen.
I've got one.
Well, I was going to say, Mark, if you could just, I know we discussed it in the recent coronavirus lockdown live stream, but
Yeah.
I'd like as well if you could mention your article on the plasma, which we alluded to earlier.
Yeah, and actually, before I forget, I'm going to throw this out there too, just for fun. So, you know, we keep an eye on the literature that's released from the organization, and you know, they released I think 2 of the new elders manuals already since January 2019, and then I think September they revised it, and then they said they would be revising it. Well, now we have a brand new letter that's just been released, dated April 2020, for announcements and reminders. And this is from a country outside of the U.S., but it appears to be a duplicate of what the U.S. and the United Kingdom is getting. So they've said that the revised Shepherd book, pleased to inform you that a revised version of the Shepherd book will soon be posted on jw.org. So soon means in April sometime, maybe in the next couple of days. But they've got a whole list here. And this will probably show up somewhere on the internet, I'm quite sure, but there's a whole list of things that they're adding. And it's really interesting to see what kind of control they're continuing. Like chapter 29, they're making a change. Paragraph 9, part 5, inserted direction to indicate that before elders contact the legal department on behalf of a publisher involved in a lawsuit over child custody and visitation matters, it should be confirmed that the publisher is in good standing in the congregation. I find this kind of interesting because the one thing that I've noticed over the years is that Jehovah's Witnesses really make a demarcation line between helping any individual who is a publisher, not just a publisher, but a publisher in good standing in the organization, and one who is not, maybe one who is an occasional meeting attender. So what they're saying here is that we are not going to get the legal department involved in any matters concerning a person other than someone who is considered in good standing in the organization. Because look, they're overwhelmed and they don't want to help anyone that's not a witness, and they certainly don't want to get involved in look, well, it kind of proves that they are still getting involved in child custody cases, even though they haven't printed a child custody booklet in a number of years. I think it's been more than 10 years since they have printed that book, which not many people know about. But anyway, so I thought I would mention that as a piece of news. There's a whole bunch of things that you're going to see online about this new Elders Manual that's coming out. And of course, you know,
when is that new Elders Manual? Is it just a straight up revision?
Yeah, so
every
so
6 months, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's supposed to be approximately every 6 months is what they said. But this is a 3-page letter that was just released from the organization, and I'll get you guys a copy of it, and then you can have a look at it. But so anyway, that's like internal organizational news. But
before we go to the plasma thing, I'm just mindful of the fact that Covert can't be with us too much longer. So what we'll do is we'll do things a bit back to front. Covert, I'd really like to hear your summary thoughts on what we've been discussing, and then you can go and Mark and I will bash out the plasma thing and give our concluding thoughts. So what are your concluding thoughts?
Concluding thoughts. I think this is really interesting because I would have killed to have the kind of video coverage of governing body members saying stuff during 1975 and actually during the World Trade Center attacks and during any other major event which Watchtower has really latched onto and had that kind of like, oh, this could be the end moment. This is the first time we've had one of these moments on video. And I think a lot of this stuff is going to, I mean, it could be that Watchtower is about to learn a valuable lesson that you don't let Anthony Morris and Stephen Lett just go off half-cocked when a major international crisis with a huge death toll and much misery and suffering is about to strike. One, because you'll look pretty callous if you're Anthony Morris, and two, because if you're Stephen Lett, your pronouncements of imminent doom might look a bit silly when the doom is no longer imminent and everyone's got it on video. So ultimately, I think this is another example of how the internet kills cults, because this is going to come back to bite them. It already probably is. And again, I just would have been fascinated to see what the video footage would have been like during the 1975 debacle or things like that.
You make an interesting point. In some ways, the governing body think they're invincible because they're going off what happened with previous leaders and previous generations of the governing body. But previous generations of the governing body didn't have to think about their pronouncements being in full HD video.
Yep.
And they're probably not exercising the appropriate caution when they reach for the doomsday trigger.
You can't turn around and say, well, Anthony Morris didn't really say that 15 years ago. And you onto YouTube, Google, and you go, well, it doesn't bother me. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, those are very prescient thoughts. Thank you very much, Covert, and thanks for joining us for this Watchtower in Focus.
No worries.
Thanks,
Take care,
Covert.
guys.
Take care. So then there were two, just me and O'Donnell.
Be talking to ourselves soon, Lloyd.
Well, it's the end of the world, so we're on the night watch just before it all goes
like
to pot.
flies. Yeah.
So you were talking to us about, I think, child custody and new elders manual. So was there anything other than the plasma, or can we summarize your article for JW Survey, because it was really interesting?
Yeah, thanks, Lloyd. So it's on JW Survey at the most recent articles. So I guess the gist of the article is that Jehovah's Witnesses have issued an edict, but what they're doing is they haven't done this through the usual channel of a monthly letter, because there's announcements that happen. I think it's an S-147 form, and those are sent out to congregations every single month. And those are similar to the one that I just talked about, where they're announcing the new elders manual. But since the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen increased comments from the organization that they are, even in some elders letters, that they are making sure that their channel of communication remains intact, which means from the governing body through the branch committees, and each country has a branch committee. Now, the US might have 20 or 30 branch committee members, and Brazil has about 25 branch committee members. A small country, has less. I'm trying to think of a good example of that, because they have consolidated a number of branches. So you have the governing body issuing directions, also with their helpers, to branch committees, and then the branch committees are issuing directives through the circuit overseers, and circuit overseer might have 20 to 25 congregations under his control or his jurisdiction. And so then the circuit overseer communicates with the coordinator of the body of elders in each congregation, and a congregation might have 100 to 200. Many of them are much larger now because they've done this consolidation. So you have this chain of command. And what was leaked to us in the case of one, I could say the state, it was an Ohio circuit overseer whose letter was leaked to the elders, in which it specifically, and I mentioned this, I quote it in the article, it mentioned that Jehovah's Witnesses will make sure that they are, if they were to contract the coronavirus, that they would not accept plasma. And they mention this because the organization is very well aware of one of the few treatments that they have successfully used against the COVID-19 virus is called convalescent plasma therapy. And convalescent plasma therapy essentially means that you've taken a patient who has recovered from the coronavirus, and his blood will contain, or her blood will contain, certain types of antibodies. And there's more than one kind of antibodies, but they will contain a certain antibody, which when that person has recovered 2 or more weeks from the virus, plasma can be taken from that individual And there have been very successful tests in China, and now it's being tested in New York, where a person can receive a transfusion of plasma from a patient who has recovered from the COVID-19 virus. And that basically triggers their immune system to respond and attack the virus or eliminate the virus. So what the society, the Watchtower Society, is seeing here is that in the midst of, like they're not going to congregation meetings, the communications have really tightened up. If a person contracts it, they might be told by, for example, in New York, the Watchtower is headquartered in New York. We've had more than 10,000 people die in the state of New York already. So they are testing this therapy. So Watchtower, being headquartered in New York, is well aware of this situation, and they're saying, hey, we know about this, but remember, Jehovah's Witnesses do not accept blood or what they call the four major components of blood: plasma, red cells, white cells, and platelets. Plasma is, all of this stuff is separated out by a centrifuge. So they can spin blood and they can separate out plasma, red cells, white cells, etc. Plasma, is a yellowish liquid that contains these antibodies. And what they're doing in many cases is taking a patient who has recovered from the virus, and they're actually taking their blood and recycling their blood back into them. But in the process, they're spinning out the plasma and then using that plasma for 2 or 3 patients. At least 2 or 3, I believe, can be helped potentially with the plasma from one recovered patient. And they've had thousands, by the way, thousands of people have reached out in New York to donate. In fact, I think Dr. Anthony Fauci even mentioned that in one of his press briefings. So people are donating plasma, trying to help people survive. And then all of a sudden, the Watchtower organization says, wait, remember, you may not partake of blood or its 4 major components. But what is interesting about the directive is that they say, however, if at some future time, or if the plasma can be extracted down to the antibodies themselves, or those are the same as immunoglobulins. I can't say that. Immunoglobulins. If it can be extracted down to that point, then potentially a witness may or may not, based on their conscience, accept those antibodies.
Immunoglobulins, I've fallen into the trap of trying to say, are a
very
interesting field of study for people who are investigating their Jehovah's Witness beliefs, because those are manufactured by harvesting vast amounts of blood of cows, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, it's all very arbitrary, isn't it? We've discussed this, the fact that, Watchtower has at some point in their past just made this arbitrary decision that the main components of blood are to be determined by how it reacts under centrifugal forces, in which case you get a layer of red blood cells, a layer of white blood cells, the plasma and the platelets. That just because that's how blood responds in a centrifuge doesn't mean that that's how God interprets the main components of blood to be. If you're talking about, for example, the oxygen-bearing capacity of blood, you're talking almost exclusively about hemoglobin, which incidentally Jehovah's Witnesses can receive because it's not determined to be one of the main components. So absolutely chilling, Mark, to consider that the coronavirus pandemic has presented one more way for Jehovah's Witnesses to die, because you have a potential treatment that immediately, before it's even necessarily in widespread use, the Jehovah's Witness teachings are saying you can't have this.
Yeah, I just located the article, and I was looking at what this circuit overseer said, which appears to be sort of a template that I'm sure other COs are using it and then modifying it to match their circuits. But the second part of what the letter says declares, it says let me just get down to it. It says, some doctors may view plasma as a fraction. Therefore, the publisher may need to explain their personal decision not to accept any of the blood's 4 main components, one of them being plasma. I find this to be an extremely loaded sentence. First of all, you have a statement, some doctors may view plasma as a fraction. So first of all, the Watchtower organization is taking it upon themselves to say, hey, wait a minute, a doctor who has spent his entire life being educated, going to, going to college and medical school and all of and an extra 4 years and all, I mean, it's an enormous amount of education. And then they're saying, oh, well, some doctors may view it as a fraction. Because remember, witnesses are permitted to take certain minor fraction components of blood. So they're saying, hey, wait a minute, there's going to be some confusion here because a doctor might say, oh, well, plasma is a fraction of blood, so you can therefore take plasma. And Watchtower is saying, no, 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 you can't. And then it follows up with this loaded statement that says, a publisher may need to explain it is their personal decision not to accept any of the blood's four main components. That
we
is
should probably just stress that this is a circuit overseer writing and not necessarily the organization.
But of course, that is reflected in Watchtower literature across the board, is that this is your personal decision. It is not their personal decision. This is a directive that started in 1945 and has developed over the years into a hospital liaison committee, patient visitation, the blood police, as they are pejoratively called, and I mentioned that in the article. So this is not a personal decision that all of Jehovah's Witnesses have made. And I would argue that if Watchtower came out with a letter tomorrow saying that, blood is sacred and it helps people survive, no, we're not to eat blood, but we can take it to preserve life because Jehovah is the giver of life. And they could spin this any way they want. They could centrifuge it. And they could come up with a policy that all Jehovah's Witnesses would immediately say, that makes sense. Blood is sacred. So I'm going to respect life. I'm not going to let my wife who just gave birth bleed out and die. And this happens all the time. Or I'm not going to let my son not get his leukemia treatments because they need many blood transfusions in many cases to save leukemia patients. And I've personally watched a young girl that I grew up with die here from Baltimore because she had leukemia in her mid-20s. And I've watched a friend of mine who had needed a liver transplant, but you can't get a liver transplant if you're not going to accept a blood transfusion. You're so low on the list that you'd never get one. And not to mention the car accidents and the women who have bled out. It happens a horrible amount, much more than you ever realize, until you talk to someone who is, who delivers babies, that sadly, women bleed out during childbirth, and the only thing that can save them in many cases is an emergency transfusion of blood. So,
well, we saw that in Eloise Dupuis, the case in that story, didn't we? Well, thank you for writing that article, Mark. Obviously, a link will be in the description for anyone who wants to check it out. Yeah. It would be really nice for us to sum up on our thoughts on what we've been discussing with Stephen and Covert. And I guess I would agree with Covert that, look, the Jehovah's Witness religion was built for the 20th century. It was built for a time when you could print anything in a book or magazine and it went pretty much unchallenged. But we find ourselves now in the 21st century, in the information age, where anything can be very easily debunked. And it's especially easy to debunk it when you're dealing with material in full HD, where you can see people's facial expressions, you can see how much they mean it. And Stephen Lett's proclamations about the last days of the last days of the final part of the last days will haunt this organization forever. And I think they have realized that. And I think they are backing down from this doomsday thing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're in a very dynamic situation, Lloyd, and it's developing very rapidly as we speak. We're still seeing an increasing number of deaths from the virus. We are seeing, I think Watchtower is I think they're slower to react than we I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, you know, they are in control of the lives of over 8 million people. So you could say that they are in control of a small nation because everyone will follow what the governing body direction is. I think they're being very opportunistic in going after, especially when they say, you must obey the superior authorities. I think those comments are going to come back to haunt them severely, especially because we deal so much, Lloyd, you and I, and so many people deal with these child sexual abuse cases in which they say, oh no, we will not report. They're told by the legal department not to report these cases to the authorities when in fact the law says you must report. And then they go to the, well, you know, we could report, but we are not going to because we have clergy penitent privilege. And then this virus comes along and they start screaming from the hilltops saying, we must obey Romans chapter 13. We must obey the superior authorities in all things, as that is the biblical direction. And I think that you're right, Lloyd. I think this is really going to come back to haunt them, if for no other reason than for their screaming demands to obey the superior authorities, because that's going to be thrown right back in their face in these child sexual abuse cases. Why don't you tell the elders to obey the superior authorities?
And to be honest, when it comes to the kind of doomsday narrative, I mean, there's no telling how bad this coronavirus is going to get. I mean, hopefully we're nearing the point where we can say we've seen the worst of it. Hopefully it will start to retreat at some point. Maybe there'll be a second wave. I'm kind of keeping my eye on the numbers. I think I mentioned at the beginning we're on over 100,000 deaths now.
Yeah.
I think the Spanish flu claimed an estimated 100 million. So it'll be interesting to see how the coronavirus ends up stacking up against the Spanish flu. But even if it exceeds the Spanish flu, that still doesn't take us to the end of the world. And even if the world were to end, let's say due to a meteor collision or some other, maybe a nuclear war, that's still not Armageddon, you know? So to jump up and down opportunistically when there is a global crisis that is scaring people already is very, very unfortunate and very, very inappropriate, and will rightly be behavior that will be called out for generations to come.
Well said, Lloyd. And I think you raised a really good point about the number of deaths during the Spanish influenza. We don't know what the end result is because we're right in the middle of Corona, but it has changed the world forever. The one thing we didn't have back in 1918 was the advanced medical techniques to identify viruses. I mean, back then, you know, it was kind of hard for them to even know what, they didn't really fully understand what the virus was. You know, and viruses, I think we're still in that learning curve. Viruses are something like 100 times smaller than a bacteria. So it is just so tiny. And it can just, you know, obviously I do agree with the organization that they should tell people to obey the superior authorities and they should stay quarantined wherever need be, if at all possible. They must do that. And that's a good thing. But we, you know, it is just, we just don't know what the numbers are going to be when the smoke settles. We're all human beings. We're all in the same situation here. And Jehovah's Witnesses are no different than anyone else. We all have to obey the superior authorities or we're going to die. And I think it is just very opportunistic of them to take advantage of this. But what do we expect? I mean, they're looking for examples of why we're in the last days. It's that, as Stephen mentioned, it's confirmation bias. Look, we've got the tsunami, or we've got 9/11, or we've got these, you know, violent acts. Now we've got pandemics, which was prophesied in the Bible. And it's just more confirmation bias, because without the confirmation bias, you start to wonder, well, am I in the true religion? Is this... And does someone else have the truth? And then you start going back to that age-old question of, why does God permit wickedness? We had the Holocaust, we have the Spanish flu, and as you mentioned, just so many hundreds of millions, or millions and millions. It's just, I can understand why people are distraught over what has happened over the past 100 years, but we are, these scientists are doing everything to keep the numbers down. We have communications now. We can stay inside and self-quarantine. For most people, it's not good, but it sure is saving a lot of lives. And well done for those. And I just want to give a shout out to those doctors in every hospital and nurses that are putting their lives on the line. Many of them have died. The bus drivers that keep on driving. One bus driver in the US went on social media and said, please stop coming on the bus and sneezing and not covering your mouth. And he implored by Facebook, he went online and said, please stop doing this. I'm a bus driver. 2 weeks later, he's dead from coronavirus. It's just tragic. And people don't understand how devastating these little tiny viruses are and how they can float around and land on a surface and then get, transferred. And, stop touching your mouth, try to not touch your mouth, or, wear the mask if you can get them. It's
a stark reminder of how fragile life is, and life being so fragile and so finite. Do you really want to waste it following a group of men in New York who don't know how to protect children and fail children?
Well said.
We hope you have enjoyed our 35th episode. Can you believe it, Mark? 35th episode of Watchtower in Focus. We hope you found this information useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.
Say to the world I